Okay, our final presentation is going to be presented by Mary Ann Scali. She is the Executive Director, the National Juvenile Defense Center, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her organization, and then she's going to talk about the kind of information that her organization collects and data that they collect and how that can be useful for you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to do this one a little bit differently than we have the past couple of days because this is the last presentation, and I'd like it not to be a presentation, but more of a conversation. So my organization is called the National Juvenile Defender Center, and as you can imagine with a name like the National Juvenile Defender Center, we do exactly what Jim said we do. We safeguard the rights of youth. But before we get started, I actually want to back up for a minute and talk to you guys about what's happened the past couple of days and ask you just to shout out. What are some things that stood out to you? What was alarming? What was new? Or what's something that you are going to go home and dig into? What's just some shout outs? Anybody?
I didn't pre-trial detention of kids. I just hadn't really thought about that before, and now I want to learn everything I can.
Okay, what a great comment, right? So this is exactly what the story is across the entire nation. People do not realize how we treat young people every day in every state, in every county across this entire country. Shout out something else.
School resource officers. Their role in schools and facilitating the school-to-prison pipeline with arresting kids.
So, Co, is that new for you?
It's like something I've been meaning to get into, but now it's like super urgent for me.
And what a critical thing, because in how many schools are we spending money on law enforcement, and what benefit is coming out of that money that we're spending in schools? Anybody else? Something you heard about that you learned?
We can make people disappear, which was said by ICE.
Right, exactly. And who are we making disappear? Our children. One more.
I was surprised to hear earlier that Republicans are leading the reform movement in a lot of states. Shocked me.
That's thanks to my colleagues like Liz and Marcy and people you've heard from throughout the past few days. Because what they have done is figured out how to message this absolute harm that we are causing to children every day in a way that resonates across lines, right? So the National Juvenile Defender Center, we say that we are nonpartisan, that our work actually is a human rights issue, and that juvenile defenders are civil rights lawyers. And they are civil rights lawyers because young people's liberty and equity is deprived every day in courts around the nation. Hernan, did he walk out for a second? So I was so happy that he rested on the issue of language. How we talk about young people and Jim's description of his story is the story that gets told across the country about our youth and about who they are. But we have an obligation. So we at the National Juvenile Defender Center, we are the only people in the court system whose job it is to lift up the voices and stories of children. We have an obligation, ethically, by law, to ensure that a young person's narrative is told in the way the young person wants it to be told. For them to write the script and for us to share it in the courtroom. Nobody else has that obligation. But what Hernan and Jim did was talk to us about the language that's used. So actually, I want to just ask a couple more questions. What are some words that we can actually put into extinction in the work that we do? What are some words that we should strike as you as journalists talk about youth? What are some things you heard about the past couple days that you're like, I'm just not going to say that anymore because I realize that's a bad idea? Inmate. Oh, amen. Inmate. Right. What young person is an inmate? What else? What words are you going to strike?
I don't know if I'm going to strike because I'd like a good suggestion on when things are viewed as, offensive or stigmatizing for better wording to substitute for.
How would you like yourself to be described? That's my answer. If you don't want it said about you, don't say it about somebody else, especially our children. Think about the people you love and how you talk about them and how you describe their strengths and what they bring forward. Really, that's the conversation. We have to shift from a dialogue of othering young people in the system to recognize we are all them and they are us. What are some words we can change?
Offender.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah.
To piggyback off that, offender, especially when it's during the pretrial part of the sentence, of their journey through the justice system, because at that point they're still presumably innocent, and I see a lot of that when they're still just accused.
All right, I'm going to take this back right on to the National Juvenile Defender Center. Right, so I've been with the organization for 20 years. I was at the table when we decided, who are we? What are we? You know, there's all this money that goes into prosecution and law enforcement, and the people who defend young people don't have a community. So we said, we are juvenile defenders. Liz Ryan was, we were all figuring out who we are and what we do. And we shouldn't ever be talking about young people as juveniles. It is the only context in with which we talk about children in that way is the court system. The only other time, if you actually have a Google search for juvenile that it comes up, is juvenile horses in races. I'm not kidding. It is such a derogatory, dehumanizing way for us to tell the story of our children. So I own that, because until I actually raise enough money to do some rebranding, we are the National Juvenile Defender Center, and we actually worked really hard to coin juvenile defense, right? We worked really hard to convince other lawyers that it shouldn't be a training ground, that it shouldn't be the place where you come right after law school and you don't really know what you're doing, so you're going to kind of cut your teeth on some kids' cases because it doesn't matter. No. Our practice of law is the most important practice of law. And if you know lawyers, love lawyers, have friends that are lawyers, they should talk about juvenile defense like they talk about capital defense. Lives are in the balance, and we should only have the best trained, most articulate, most committed lawyers doing juvenile defense. So that's what our organization is about. So, due for due process, I hope all of you have a few things on your table in front of you. One of them is a sticker that either says overdue for due process or due for due process. And here again, language matters so much. The words that we use to talk about what is due to children in the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment is all about rights. So every issue that you've brought up today and yesterday are all weighted in rights. So whether it's sex offenses or immigration or incarceration or pretrial detention, it's all rooted in rights. And why is the National Juvenile Defender Center a place that I feel very fortunate to be a part of? Because the group of people that we represent do not have a voice. Their rights are rights that are unheard of, and they are hidden, and that we don't know about. So back to the issue of pretrial detention, right? The fact that most of our community members, most of my family, we sit around at Thanksgiving, and I've been doing this work for 20 years. They have no idea. Look up at the slide. We are the nation that incarcerates the most children in the world. You heard it time and time again. But here's the visual. You guys are journalists. This is my colleague, Jose Loya, who's walking around, passing around flash drives that have a slate of resources in addition to what we passed out. And the reason I'm introducing him at this moment is because it is Jose, who is our communications and development manager, who has kind of kicked us into the century of dialogue and visual information. So we've been at the law thing for a long time. We haven't been at the communications or visualization of information thing for long at all. And what I love about Jose is when he came in, he said, I've been hearing about the National Juvenile Defender Center for a long time, and I use your resources. But I only use them because I'm actually embedded in a PD office. Regular people don't know anything about the National Juvenile Defender Center, about what we do to children. You've got to turn information into pictures. So he's really pushed us to try to visualize information. So this is it, guys. 10 years ago, we incarcerated children 10 times the rate of the next nation in the world. So we've gotten a little bit better. You can see now that this is the rate for us, 94,000. The next country is Cyprus, 46. That's just the rate, right? We are so out of whack with the rest of the world in our incarceration numbers. What else are we out of whack with? This map. This was an article done by The Economist in 2016. And again, when I think about the power that you guys have and how much we really are going to be depending on you, how much we do depend on you to help us translate this work and this message, it's all about the stories. So this is the story not of what Marcy was talking about earlier with transfer to adult court. This is basic prosecution. Young people in almost every state in the United States can be prosecuted at any age. I was a public defender in Baltimore City. We had 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds in shackles, leg irons, belly chains, carted through the courthouse in what looked like a chain gang. Look where your state is. So California just changed theirs this week, so yay again to anybody from California. The minimum age there is now 12, first state in the nation. So we're happy that this is out of date for California. Yes, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. You've also heard about youth behavior, and you've heard about how young people have been brought in for nonviolent behavior. What this shows you, again, is that visualization. It's the nonviolent behavior. It's the criminalization of young people and the racial and ethnic disparities, right? So a lot of you have asked questions about what's the story, what's the information about racial and ethnic disparities in the system. So at the National Juvenile Defender Center, we work really hard to collect the data, to share the information, and actually to empower states to make change, to engage in reform. And this gives you the data that you've heard about for the past 2 days, but it visualizes it, right? So you can use this information to tell the story. And the racial disparities story that you've heard about the past couple of days, this is the line that you want to look at right over here. Right? It's gotten worse. Our racial disparities have gotten worse, despite the fact that reforms have made things better. And what's really important about this slide is not so much those charts, but it's OGJDP's database, right? So even though it's the federal government, they have the best source for data. They have girls' data, they have racial and ethnic disparity data, they've got it all. So we talked about the fact that youth rights are civil rights. And really, our young people are starting to lobby and lift up their voices. But without the partnership of journalists like each of you, there's nobody to tell their stories. So our job is to tell those stories in court. But without you guys, they don't have their own lobby. They can't vote to make change on their rights. So we really have to partner with media in order to get the stories out. So what are the things that we're working on at the National Juvenile Defender Center? So we've got 4 basic approaches to our work. And these are actually pretty new. Because when I stepped into the current role that I have, we actually did a survey with our community, with our board, with young people, and said, what should we be focusing on? Of course, specialization in juvenile defense is something we've always done, but it became very clear that we have to be much more intentional about youth rights and equity. And what does that mean? It means that we as lawyers have to raise race in our individual cases. It means we have to be at the policy table looking at the laws that actually increase racial disparities, looking at racial impact statements, and making sure that in each piece of our work, we're including that data and information. We also want to be sure that defenders are at the policy table, and that's kind of different. I don't know if any of you worked with defenders on stories? Yes, so I see some. How many people have got a defender who's been helpful on a story? Awesome. Have been. Helpful on a story. Excellent. So that's relatively new. For a long time, defenders wouldn't talk to reporters. We were really afraid of what you were going to say about our clients. And we have realized that the voice that you give to our clients and to our stories has a huge impact on the outcomes. And we've created regional centers across the nation. So this is what makes the National Juvenile Defender Center what I consider to be a really special place to be. We have lawyers in every state across the country who are working on what we hope the stories are that you're going to be reporting on. And that community of lawyers is committed to ensuring that youth rights and equity are lifted up. So no matter what's happening on the ground, the successes in California this week, the harms that are occurring in the facilities, be it Wisconsin or Florida, our community is talking to us, and our job, hopefully, if you're interested, is to connect you to them so that you can tell those stories. And why does the right to counsel actually matter? And what's the language in it? Well, of course, young people have their constitutional rights that were given in re Galt. So you all have a copy of what we call the Pocket Galt. And in there, we've highlighted some quotes for you that you can use in your stories. And the Pocket Galt actually talks about the fact that young people have to be afforded access to an effective lawyer. And those rights are really rooted in due process, which is different than Gideon. It's different than the Sixth Amendment right. And why does that matter? Because it's all focused on process. It's focused on due process, meaning that we have to ensure that the system that's put in place is fair and just for children, when we know that the system actually is just making children go through the system. And here's just the citation for In re Galt, and you've got it there. And you've talked about the Supreme Court decisions. The only reason I put this up is because I would suggest that you should want to read them. There are beautiful words in those decisions about young people. There is great language for you to use in stories that you tell about young people that can be supported by the Supreme Court. So this is just some quotes from those decisions about young people and their adolescent development. I'll just read the Graham one. Because juveniles have less culpability, they are less deserving of the most severe punishments. Right? So when you're writing a story about something that's happening to a youth, culpability matters. So what is our work focused on since the 50th anniversary of Galt, which was last year? Well, we decided it would probably be a good idea to figure out, are young people getting lawyers? How many of you are in a state where you know young people go through the system, like Jim said, without a lawyer? Okay, we've got one. Where are you from?
Maryland.
Oh, Maryland. Oh, my God, that breaks my heart. That's where I'm from. Okay, we know that only 11 states provide every child a lawyer, regardless of financial status. So believe it or not, this whole fees and costs issue, as a young person, you have to apply to the court to get your right to counsel and prove that you can't afford to get a lawyer. And a lot of times, you know what? You have an application fee to actually do the application to get that free lawyer. How crazy is that? We also know that 43 states allow children to waive the right to a lawyer without first consulting with a lawyer. So let's imagine, for example, that I go to court and you're my judge and you say, here you are today. If you just tell me you did this, you can go home tomorrow. But then you tell me, Sarah, but if you fill out this paperwork and you give me $25, we can get you a lawyer. What would you do? What's the Hobson's choice for a young person? We should automatically deem young people get a lawyer, and they should be able to talk to a lawyer before they ever waive that right. These stories in 36 states where children are charged fees for their free lawyer. So how many of you are in one of these states where children are charged for a lawyer? This is current. Oh, this is not current because California hasn't been taken off. No, you're totally right. California eliminated fines and fees. So our Access Denied report came out last year. I'm sorry that we forgot to take it off. California was not updated on either of our slides. And it's such a good example, though, of why we can make progress on this. Because most people, I saw your faces when you looked at this picture, right? People don't know that we charge children for the right to a lawyer in most states, that children are actually given a bill at the end of their experience in juvenile court.
Who's making that decision? Is it the court administration or the state or those juvenile defender offices?
That's a great question. So who's making the decision about what children get charged varies from state to state. Sometimes it's an automatic fee that they get charged, and sometimes there is some discretion the court has about what the children get charged.
Oh, my question was just going to piggyback off of that. So what if the child is found not guilty and exonerated of all charges? Do they still pay the fee?
Yeah, that is also a great question, and that depends on your state as well. So some states, the only time that a child is not charged is when they're found not guilty. But in some states, even when a child is found not guilty, there's an administrative fee just for going through the court process, just for the pleasure of going through the court process. We also know, and we talked a little bit about fines and fees. It came up that children are charged for everything in the court system, for their mental health evaluations, for their detention, for being placed on probation and supervision. One of the resources you'll see on your thumb drive is about the costs of probation, so you can see the data in your own state about what children are charged. All right, so what do we hope that you guys can report on in the next year that would be great in terms of advancing the conversation? So there's 3 pieces of work that we are doing right now that we would love your partnership on. One, Liz already talked about, court observation. Shockingly, to us, there had never been a national sample created of juvenile courts across the country, meaning we can't get information from every court across the nation about most issues. And one issue that we absolutely cannot get information about is whether or not children have lawyers by their side. Courts don't collect the data. We did a pilot. The only state that could report it was Nebraska. The only reason Nebraska could report it is because we had grad students go into files and check the court records to see if children had lawyers. And in many places in Nebraska, they did not. So we're going to institute a court observation project. And just like Liz said, we would love your partnership on that. When this sample is created, we would love for you to help us talk about what's seen in courts across the nation. We're not going to launch it until sometime in 2019, because right now we are working with a statistician to build the national sample. But we know that we have to be in at least 100 of the 3,100 counties across the country in order to have a representative sample. This is an assessment. So one of the keystones of our work is conducting access to and quality of counsel reports. We have been in 24 states. What do we do to collect data and information? We interview you. If you were all in one state, we would want to talk to you, whether you are a probation officer, a judge, a juvenile defender, a prosecutor, a young person, a court administrator. We would ask you, what do you see? Do young people get lawyers here? And when they get those lawyers, do you see motions filed or arguments made? And what we see is astounding. Unlike one of the other speakers who said, when they know we're coming, they paint the walls. For some reason, they don't do that for juvenile defense. We have been in courtrooms where young people who are facing serious charges like rape and homicide don't have lawyers. I've had a judge look at me in the back and say, someone told you what your lawyer does for you, right? And the young person says, no. And then the judge looks in the back and says, but you want a lawyer, right? And the young person looks at their parent and says, no. And then the judge says, Proration, prosecutor, what do we do? The young person doesn't know. The young person turns around and looks at their parent and they say, we're not going to proceed because we heard that we're going to get charged $50 or $250 or $400. So we're going to waive our right. By us being in the courtroom observing those, I have had judges say, oh, I think we're going to get you a lawyer for this one. They knew we were coming and they didn't change their practice, and we see this all over the nation. It is a crisis in terms of the Constitution. And people don't know. They don't know what's happening in terms of constitutional rights for children. Here's some examples of the costs of counsel in Arizona. And all of this came from, I heard you talk about FOIAs, state data collection. How do we get this information from states? So we ask questions, and just like you heard, we simply request it, and sometimes we're given information, and sometimes we do formal record requests in states. And these are the kinds of things we learn. $25 to apply for a lawyer, $25 to get the lawyer, and then $250 or $400. This report was just released 2 weeks ago. It is on your thumb drive, and you can see the range of data available on fines and fees. We're going to be releasing assessment reports in 4 states in the next 2 years. We're not sure which states those are going to be, but it really is part of this movement to figure out what fines and fees look like across the country, as well as what access to counsel looks like. The consequences of the juvenile court system is something else. Somebody asked, you heard Jim talk about applying for jobs and Hernan talk about applying for jobs. The fact that people think juvenile court is benign and that it doesn't impact their jobs, housing, families get kicked out of housing because juvenile court adjudications, financial aid. These are some of the consequences just in the state of Arizona. Probation fees, restitution fees, a cost to get your record expunged. There is this idea that youth court records go away. How many people in here prior to this thought, when you turn 18, they just disappear? They don't. They don't just disappear. In most states, it's actually a pretty complicated process to get your juvenile court record expunged. And it takes years after you turn 18 to get rid of them. This is, again, just another map of what are some of the consequences. Probation extension, civil judgment, waiver of counsel, tax intercepts, interest, no record destruction or set aside. We are working, again, our work takes time. We're working on doing collateral consequences information booklets with young people, in partnership with young people in every state. We started 2 years ago, and we've got 10 states done. We have been told by young people who we work with that nothing is more important than having decision makers understand what the consequences of juvenile court look like. In schools, people do not realize that when a young person actually gets some level of offense, automatically they can be taken out of their local school. It's critical that we inform people about the consequences of juvenile court adjudications. So we have an unofficial reform effort ongoing, really in light of the 50th anniversary, and it's called Ensuring Access. But it's a partnership that's really meaningless without your interest or without your investment in it, because it's telling the story of how young people don't have their rights safeguarded across our states. And it's the rights that you've all been talking about for the past 2 days. What we would love to do is partner with you to talk about what it looks like where you are, what's happening to young people where you are, and to help you tell the stories to actually create reform. What we know is that in states that begin to understand what happens to children, reform is possible. So even before we got Ensuring Access out, as we were doing the phone calls and interviews and data collection across the country, Massachusetts and Delaware were like, oh, yeah, that whole indigence procedure, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Already, Massachusetts and Delaware have gotten rid of their indigence procedure. So no longer do young people have to fill out an application or pay a fee before they get a lawyer in those 2 states. All right, so we sped through this to give you a big overview of who we are and what we do. What Jose provided to you on the thumb drives was a range of resources. And those are available to you to use as you wish. And what I hope to do now is have a conversation with you about any piece of this you are interested in, that you want to report on, that you want to learn about, more about us, more about the work that we do.
This report about access and fees, when was that released, or it's about?
So there were several reports described about access and fees. The one from Arizona came out 2 weeks ago. The one that's called Access Denied, that's on your thumb drives, came out on May 15th, 2017. It was the 50th anniversary of the In re Galt decision. So the PowerPoint is not on your thumb drive, but Steve or Joe, can we do that? Okay, we can make that available. No problem. Happy to do that. Other questions, thoughts?
Any data that you've collected, any data that you've collected, any data that you have, any information about accessing information, this is like gold for our fellows here.
Great. And which is really why we wanted to show those data slides, to ensure that you actually had access points to the data. I think there's been a lot of conversations about that for the past couple of days, but I hadn't seen a lot of people sharing where they actually got all that data from. So each of these slides has a home site where you can figure out where the information is.
And you could visualize it yourself. We had, in one of our other fellowship programs, we actually had a class or a seminar in data visualization, and we discovered that some folks didn't need it because they had it in their own outlets, but it's something to think about when you're doing your stories in print or online, to think about projecting some of the material you've got in an interesting way in graphs and data visualizations. But if you need help in that, let us know.
Yes.
I got it.
So I'm interested in knowing more about default punishment for people who don't pay, for the families who can't afford the fees.
Yeah, so it happens different in every state. So some of the things that we put up there were just examples of what happens. What's crazy about default punishment is that when young people turn 18, some states it turns into a civil judgment. Sometimes young people are actually kept on probation until they can close out all their probation fees or any fees they have related. Some states, they actually incur violations of probation, right? So a young person who otherwise had done everything they were supposed to do in terms of the pathway to success, because they couldn't pay the fees, or then violated, sent into a facility, and actually pushed deeper into the system.
So what about the families?
So that also varies from state to state. So some states, the young person is liable for the fees and penalties. In some states, it's the family and child jointly. In some states, it's the family and child separately. Does that answer that question?
Kind of, but I guess my question is more about the depth of the penalty. So, for example, let's just say I'm your son.
Yes.
Right? And I'm in jail.
Yes.
And you have to pay for me while I'm in jail. Now, you can't afford it. You can't afford it. What happens to you?
Yeah, so tax intercepts, civil judgments against families. We've seen, parents who've contacted us who young people are incarcerated and they get a bill for crazy amounts like $10,000. Yeah. We've heard that, tens of thousands of dollars that families are charged. Mm-hmm. And what happens to those families if they can't pay the bill and they, try and mortgage their house and do everything else? Literally, their wages are garnished and civil judgments are executed, which is, horrific. First of all, your child's taken from you and then you're charged for it. Yeah.
So one of my clients in Philadelphia, where I worked before I came to D.C., young man was sent away, kept smoking weed. So then they sent him off to this placement for 9 to 12 months, depending on how he behaved. But his mother was getting paid. She had to pay the whole time, and eventually she had to sell her house just because she couldn't afford it. Yeah. So, yeah, we're criminalizing poverty.
So we briefly touched upon life after juvenile detention and how that impacts people for the rest of their lives. And we've talked a lot about racial disparities leading up to juvenile detention. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you have any information, data, anecdotes on racial disparities after juvenile detention and those impacts on the lives of white people versus people of color.
So are white youth more successful coming out of detention than black and brown youth? Is that really the question?
Yeah. Or impacts on jobs, education, housing, like all those things that you were saying, it's so much harder to achieve.
What we do know is that in every aspect of the system that black and brown children are pushed further and receive worse consequences. So in my mind, do I imagine that it's easier for a white young person to get back into school? I don't have the data to support that. I'll look to my friend Liz here. I have to imagine that's true. Is it more likely that a black and brown family would get pushed out of housing than a white family? Again, I don't have the data for that. I don't know. I know in my own experience, I practiced in Baltimore City. Always seemed to me that where leniency was given, it was given to white children.
Can I just say that the Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the JDDPA, has a core requirement in it. Almost every state participates in it, and it requires states to track the overrepresentation of young people of color in the system. And so almost every state certifies that at every point in the system. Young people of color are treated much more harshly and much more punitively than white youth. So that's been documented for at least the last 20 years. That's in the system. But you're talking about after the system? Yeah, and the thing is, what does out mean? Not being incarcerated, or does that mean they're in the community and still on probation? You know what I mean? Like, because that. Yeah, I think if you look at the data, if kids get incarcerated in the juvenile justice system, they are dramatically more likely to be then incarcerated in the adult system. So out is really hard, actually. Like you see, it almost becomes a lifetime cycle. So I think there's a huge story on that hasn't really been covered.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, jumping back to the fees and costs and things that amount. Are there any states that charge for like the health care?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the health care of children while they're in the system. Yes, they have to pay for their own mental health assessments. They have to pay for their food. When you start to dig into these fees and costs, it is so astoundingly horrific. It would be a great national story for all of you to work on. Just the record requests we did in Arizona blew our minds. 19 different fee and cost assessments in just one state. it's astounding. Yeah, I'm sorry. The answer is yes.
Okay, so just want to make sure.
Hi, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead. All right. So we've heard a lot about, we're near the end of our time here. We've heard a lot about Roper and Graham and the five decisions that have sort of set the country on this reform course. I'm wondering how you and your colleagues across youth advocacy, how durable does this era of reform feel to you? Since my loose understanding,
Today, not so durable.
Well, but I mean, like they can't change Supreme Court decisions, whoever's in the administration, So I'm just wondering how you compare, how durable is it compared to earlier eras of reforms in the 20th century?
Yeah, so I'm just really appreciative that you asked that question because it's two different questions in my mind. One is, can the Supreme Court decisions get overturned? Absolutely, right. Do we hope that they will not? I hope that they will not, simply because I think states have taken up this this recognition that young people are different. I think we have a lot of work to do across the country for every state to take it on. But like Craig talked about incentives versus punishment, you've heard lots of speakers through the past couple of days. We know now that actually the conversation we're having is about public safety. Right, so why do I have a little bit of faith that they're durable? Because when young people succeed, communities are safer. When we actually invest in communities and youth, we do better for tax dollars. So my faith that we actually will continue to make progress is because we now have the evidence that what we did was so wrong for communities, so wrong for us as people. I have some hope in us as humanity that we have learned from that very egregious mistake of losing all of these children's lives. So that's my hope. How durable? As durable as we are.
Can you briefly explain for people who, like me, can you please explain why the Galt decision doesn't do what the Miranda and things, if you don't have a lawyer, we will appoint you a lawyer. The Galt, Miranda, you don't have to pay. When you have a court-appointed lawyer in the adult system and you say, I'd like a lawyer, you don't pay for it if you're an adult, right?
How many people have you reported on that actually get a lawyer when they ask for one at Miranda?
I've never reported on the issue. I have no idea.
Yeah, so not very many. So yes, you can exercise that right, and hopefully questioning stops. But actually, to get a lawyer to come to a police station, it happens in very few places.
But they say we will provide one for you.
Mm-hmm.
If they provide one for you, does the adult?
Yeah, of course,
have
absolutely.
To pay?
So the Miranda does apply to children.
And adults and children both have to pay for attorneys. As suspects. In other words, what I'm saying is, if you can't afford a lawyer, Miranda warning says if you can't afford a lawyer, we will provide you one. Now, my question is does that apply for adults in practice? And it apparently doesn't apply for children, and that's news to me.
So my learning, so this is just me learning from all of you, quite frankly. What I know about fines and fees comes from all of your reporting. I don't know about adults' fines and fees. It's not the space I work in. But what I have read from what you all have reported on is that adults are paying even at that point. That's what I've learned.
Well, these are administrative costs, so it's
Yes.
a little bit different than the...
That's right. There are many different things. We have fees, costs, penalties, fines, bail. Yes.
Some places charge, but it's a lot less than oh, sorry. Like in San Diego, you have to pay $50 an adult.
So you guys are the experts on this one.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you had talked about fines and fees and how they apply if your child is incarcerated or put in the system. But how does that apply to like restitution costs and fines? Because I report in Oregon, and we had a huge wildfire last year that was started by a 15-year-old that threw a firecracker. And the judge fined that kid $37 million, which is obviously never going to be paid. So.
Right.
How does that work on the family?
So I'm really glad that you asked that question. So restitution, we actually have been working with judges across the country on the issue of fees, costs, and restitution. Restitution is the issue that courts actually respond very differently to. There is this idea that restitution really should have an ability to pay hearing. When you hear about reforms that are happening across the country, the conversation that we are hearing more about is about assessing a reasonable restitution cost that a young person and or a family could pay. Our judges that we worked with, who are all, let me just say, forward-minding judges, there was only one judge on this council who was willing to say we should also eliminate restitution for youth. So when you look at the bench card that's on the thumb drive, it says restitution should be based on ability to pay. So it is a different analysis, and there's different reform.
Okay, I have a question that might be a little awkward to ask you, but I live in a state where the chief public defender is elected. I don't know how common that is, but I hear from a lot of juvenile defense attorneys who aren't public defenders that if you're a kid in my county and you are brought up on felony charges, that you are either going to take a plea or the charges are dropped. Like, juvenile trials just don't happen where I live. And I wonder how to go about covering that, because that seems like a problem to me, that you get one of two outcomes, right, regardless of you know, the facts, your ability to, you know, to have the state prove those against you in some instances. So how would I go about...
So it's such a good question, right? So we're really looking at the whole court system nationally. And what you hear about on the adult side is also the juvenile side. So 90% of cases go to plea. What can we do? So how do we cover that story? So in the Arizona assessment, you'll see the data that we were collecting there. One judge actually, when we said, so how many trials have you had? You know, he picked up a pile of paper that was like this. He goes, so I've been on the bench for 20 years. That's it.
I had a judge tell me she hasn't had a trial in like a year and a half.
So I think the court observation technique that's been talked about is a really good one. I also think that some court data exists. I think it's hard to get because we have a hard time getting that data on trials and pleas. But you can also talk to your public defenders. And, you know, we have a lot of work to do ourselves. We really work hard to say we should file more motions and actually investigate cases and ensure that every legal defense is covered. If it were your child in the courtroom, what would you want done? You would want a trial. You would want a trial.
Okay, final question.
Oh.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you guys for all you're going to do on all this.